This is Business Edge on News Central. I'm Tolulokwe Adeleru Balogun. Our headline story: South African wealth tax. Now, taxing the rich in South Africa is projected to increase the Rainbow Nation's earnings with $10 billion. Recent research showed that this is possible. We'll focus on the facts around this and explain the possibility of Africa's most industrialized nation getting more from its wealthy. We'll also touch base with a few stories we're keeping our eyes on with NC4 to watch before we wrap up the show. Welcome. This is Business Edge. Now, an annual wealth tax on the net worth of South Africa's richest people could raise as much as 160 billion rand, about $10.7 billion, and would also narrow inequality in a nation where the most affluent 1% of the population own 55% of personal wealth. A recent study carried out by groups including the World Inequality Lab assessed personal wealth in South Africa and proposed a range of taxes on net worth of above 3.82 million rand, or the top 1% of the population. South Africa is one of the world's most unequal nations, a legacy of the apartheid system of racial discrimination that disadvantaged the black majority and ended in 1994. The concentration of wealth is more extreme than in France, the United States, the UK, Russia, China, or even India, and has not decreased since 1993, according to the study. Now, under the moderate tax scenario, about 350,000 individuals would be subject to the tax, with the level ranging from 3% to 7%, depending on affluence. The top rates would apply to people with a net worth of above 146.89 million rand and would only be levied on wealth above that level. The study said that raising 160 billion rand in taxes would be equivalent to about 3.5% of South Africa's gross domestic product. Joining me is the Chief Investment Officer for Ovid Capita, Ekos Akpokabayen, and we will of course get to him in just a moment. Technology is deciding to act like it can, but this conversation about wealth tax is one that's not just happening here on the continent, but is happening globally as well. A number of countries have actually had a wealth tax for a number of years, but not everybody kept it. Ekos, good morning and welcome again to Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, good morning.
I should say good afternoon, because yes, it's afternoon in South Africa now. So let's get straight to it. We hear taxes and we understand what it means. We work, government decides to take a portion out of what we have worked for. But when it comes to what a wealth tax is, can you quickly just give us, what is the definition of a wealth tax?
A wealth tax basically is targeted to the rich. So you look at the population, those that earn within a very high threshold of their income and bonuses, and the government can target those population. And if you look at most countries, you'll find that just like what you said, that 1% is controlling 55% of the wealth in South Africa.
Yeah.
So you can see if you tax that 1%, you obviously get what you will get in the rest of the population. So targeting that 1% is directed, and it's called the wealth tax.
So this taxing would not just be on income, it can also be on assets, it can also be on real estate. What would it encompass?
Can you repeat that again, quickly?
So would the taxing only solely be on generated income, or would it also include paintings, real estate, vehicles? What could be taxed?
Yes, it's any asset belonging to wealthy individuals. Remember, this is not company tax. It could be what you own, like your toys, your expensive cars, even jewelry. It can go as well as anything that you own that is of value, and which government can get tax revenue from.
Okay, so now according to this study, taxing the rich is a good policy tool that would help debt reduction. Tax the rich, reduce your debt. Do you agree with this?
Yes, of course. I think, first of all, you have to look at the country, and you have to look at the population that are rich and the inequality. If you look at South Africa has a very huge inequality between the poor and the rich. And previously, advantaged and previously disadvantaged. And that inequality will show the country how to deal with its tax. But definitely, in most countries, the rich are always taxed more. The rich are always taxed more, and it's a given. It's how much you want to tax the rich. But there needs to be a balance. You cannot make it a war between the rich, the poor, and the government. There needs to be a balance. And for me, I would say, most importantly, I know most African countries are struggling to look for extra revenue. And there's talk in South Africa of this wealth tax and taxing the rich. But we will say that in Africa, we have to look inwards, especially increasing the capital market. But I can talk on that later.
Okay. So you talked about this not turning into a war between the rich, the government, and the poor. So in terms of the tax, many also say that this would be a relief mechanism for poor South Africans, that they would not have as much burden, that there could be excess money in their pockets, which they can then spend on the economy. So do you think taxing the wealthy actually really translates to less taxes for the poor?
Yes, I agree. Yeah, it will. One of the things we have to look at from the data that came out last week, or I think it was early this week on Monday, that data showed that the rich made more money since last year, since the pandemic. They were paid more bonuses. So when you look at the GSE, all the top CEOs and all the top directors were paid more, even more before the pandemic. So they were getting more money. They were getting richer. But when you look at the poor or most of the other population, they were losing their jobs and they're struggling. So, of course, it's not targeting the rich. Of course, it's just normal. They continue to benefit in an economy that is struggling in a pandemic. So it's just fair for the rich to pay more towards the economy.
So when we talk about the rich, they also have resources available to them that the rest of us don't. And some of those resources include the ability to move their money to other places. Now, the possibility of capital flight and reduction in investment is a possible risk of taxing the wealthy. How can South Africa guard against this if they're actually truly sincere about bringing in a wealth tax?
Yeah, South African government, especially the president, is very good. One of the best ways is, first of all, consultation. In South Africa has a lot of unions. South Africa has a lot of organizations and associations that engages through the private sector to government. And this is a government initiative. So what government needs to do is to first consult and make sure the wealthy people, of course, it's 1%, it's not very difficult to get across to them, to understand this is not an attack, first of all, on them, but the country is, we need nation building, we need more access to revenue to balance the books, and so there needs to be that consultation. And I'm very sure the president has been very good at this. We saw the way he handled the pandemic at the early stage with very good consultation. So first of all, that's the first way. The second way is monetary control. The monetary control of the country currently is quite good. The monetary control has to show how capital can leave the country, the capital flights, what are the reasons you want to move money, and what are the loopholes. And one area we've seen concern, and which experts have been raising concern recently, is we've seen a lot of rich people using their wealth in this country and buying gold and precious metal, and then metal abroad. But we don't know the percentage of that. But we think with more engagement in government, there will be cooperation from the rich. And we saw that with the Solidarity Front in South Africa, where government called on the rich people and they were able to raise few billions for the country without any tax. This was voluntary. So if the government engage with them more, we'll see a smooth ride in taxing the wealthy.
Okay, so this wealth tax conversation is not just one that's being held in South Africa. We saw it come up many times in the United States in recent times. We've seen people like Bill Gates and Warren Buffett also talk about, you know, the fact that they believe the wealthy should be taxed more. Back in 1990, around a dozen European countries had some form of a wealth tax. Today, only 4 European countries have it: Spain, Norway, Switzerland, and Belgium. Most European governments have actually eliminated the tax because for them, they said it was problematic in design and enforcement. And France actually scrapped theirs in 2017. And many criticize the tax as saying it often hits people with plenty of assets, but little cash on hand to actually pay the tax man. So how do you think South Africa can make it work where others have not? And what lessons do you think, if South Africa is actually going to tax the wealthy, what lessons will South Africa take for countries who have tried this, and those who are being successful and those who have failed?
You see, like I said in the beginning, each country must look at its culture, its dynamics. South Africa is a quite different country. South Africa had appetite for over 60 years, and it's the country with the highest inequality in the world. So obviously, South Africa has to handle its own problems based on the current situation. And one of what we see in South Africa that is very dangerous is that South Africa economy was put in a junk status. It was downgraded in the last few years. So to borrow money, to play in the world economy has been very difficult. To source capital as well has been very difficult. But one of the rooms is just temporary. We cannot compare developed economies to emerging markets and developing economy. South Africa has to be able to balance its book. It has to be able to show transparency in using this tax. It's one of the things that is quite important. It has to show that this revenue collected were used properly. And over time, this money needs to use to empower most of its population, to educate them so that they become also productive. And then in the future, the wealth tax, of course, the dynamics will change like developing nations. But at this point, South Africa is a very peculiar nation, and it is no doubt. If you look at all the economies in the world, it has the highest rate of inequality, the highest rate between the rich and the poor. It has the highest, so that is very troubling.
All right, so we're going to take a break here. When we come back, we talk about who else can be taxed. The diaspora, could they be looking at taxes specifically for them? Internet tax and cable tax, is it coming for you in South Africa? And then what should we anticipate from the February budget speech by the Minister of Finance? All of that conversation right after this. Thank you so much for staying with us. This is still Business Edge and the conversation around taxing South Africa's wealthy. That's part one of our conversation. Now we moved on to looking at who else might be taxed, because South Africa does find itself in quite a precarious financial situation. My guest is still with me. So Ekos, let's look at this. Now, South Africa has also been looking at taxing even diaspora workers in order to increase its revenue base. How feasible is this really? And they're actually not the only African country that has sort of brought up this conversation about taxing diaspora workers. We know that Eritrea introduced what has been a very criticized tax, but a lot of other countries are also looking at it as well. What are your thoughts on this?
Yes, look, South Africa, there's no hiding it that South Africa is in problems in terms financially, and South Africa is looking for opportunities to increase its revenue as much as it can. And one of the ways is looking at the diaspora tax. But I don't think it's going to come anytime soon. The reason why is because of the complexity of South African diaspora. And when you look at a lot of South African diaspora and the laws, most of them are holding two citizenships, a lot of, especially the white population of European descent. So it's been very tricky. Those have been the target who can really bring a lot of revenue to the government. So, but the government is looking at it, the tax experts are looking at it. It's one way in the future we'll look at. In 2019, one of the ways, and it was a big debate and struggle, South Africa increased its VAT from 14% to 15%. But one of the ways it safeguarded for the poor, the most vulnerable in the society, was to exempt certain goods like maize meal and bread so that they will not be affected. But experts are still looking at that. And we are saying that temporarily they will not be affected, but in the long run there will be. So I know this is being looked at properly, but I don't think it will happen anytime soon.
Okay, so we're also hearing that internet tax and cable tax are some of the issues on the table, and they are examples of new tax systems which have been adopted across many nations. We can also see case studies here on the continent where countries have adopted an internet tax and how is that it has affected internet businesses and also internet usage in the countries. Do you see more African countries actually copying this module? If it works, we're still in the stage where we're trying to see, is it worth the stress of taxing people who are using the internet? Is it worth the stress of taxing those who are using some form of cable? So could more African countries adopt this if we see that it works?
Yes, we've seen in Uganda. Uganda is already taxing its population on the internet tax and the tax cable. South Africa was looking at it in order to improve the infrastructure. Certainly, with time, countries will follow suit. But I think it's too early because at the continent, we have 1.3 billion people in Africa, and we only have about 500 million using mobile communication and just about 300 million using the internet. And there's no internet in most places, and we want that to grow. So, of course, once we see the migration of more users using the internet and to improve the infrastructure, once we see more economic activities moving from hand to hand, person to person to digital, then most government will move into that. But it shouldn't be rushed. It should be balanced so that it does not discourage and it does not exempt, especially those in the rural areas who are poor in those economies, because Africa has a lot of inequalities and a lot of poorer countries. So that's why I don't think there should be a rush, but we see this going slowly in the future. I know governments are desperate for revenue, but we also must be careful. We must allow this internet economy to grow properly, to bear its fruits.
All right, I want to see if you can tell the future for us. So South Africans have been told to brace up because there may be an increase, very likely, in taxes announced when the finance minister makes his budget speech at the end of February. There's support, and because of the efforts that the Treasury is making to support the COVID-19 vaccine rollouts, that seems to be one of the reasons taxes may be increased. This is also combined with high unemployment, and what is a shrinking tax base has spelled trouble for a country that is already in financial trouble. The finance minister penciled in about 40 billion rand in additional revenue through taxes by 2024. Starting with 5 billion rand in 2021-2022, 10 billion in 2022 to 2023, 10 billion also in 2023 to 2024, and 15 billion from 2024 to 2025. Where do you really think these taxes, the money, will actually come from? And while we are about a month out, what do you also think will be announced in that budget speech?
For sure, I think the wealth tax is going to go in because that's already 10 billion in extra revenue. That's a given. And but I would say something. One of the struggle is because of the dynamics of the race population in that wealth gap. So in that race population, the 1% is mostly South Africans of European descent. And over time, there's been a struggle not to put that because politically it will seem as if there was a target in that race. But unfortunately, the time has come as South Africa has increased its VAT and there's no much room for it anymore. So I see definitely one of the areas is the wealth tax that has to come in. We are also looking at taxes in alcohol is going to come in, taxes, more duties in cigarette. And there's still debate on the fuel tax to see the fuel tax and how to do it. So those are basically more indirect tax. But of course, no one in our circle wants to be the finance minister at this time, especially in the last 3 years.
Yeah, so no one wants to be in that difficult position. Okay, yes. So Ekos, before we wrap up, you mentioned, and I also mentioned earlier in the introduction, about how unequal South African society is, particularly when it comes to finances and the economy. It's actually the most unequal society we have on the planet. So this is my final question to you. Aside from taxing the wealthy, who you say there's a historical context of being white South Africans attached to that, and there's political conversations around that, how else can South Africa address this enormous inequality, this enormous gap between the rich and the wealthy, the 2% of South Africans who are controlling more than 55% of the wealth of the country. And when you look at what the middle class controls, combined with the middle class and what the lower classes control, is not even close to what the 1 or 2% of the wealthiest South Africans control. So how does South Africa really start getting a handle on this inequality?
One of the secret in building any nation, first of all, it's its education and its health. To build a nation, you need to give good health and good education. You'll be shocked. That's what research and data has shown. South Africa also has a problem with its land. About 100 years ago, the land of Black people were taken away, and it was put in the hands of few. And that has been a problem in order to get the land situation right. It's become a lot of being political, and South Africa has monitored what happened in Zimbabwe and the attacks Zimbabwe received. And that's why the government has been very careful. I think if South Africa can get the land right, and educate its people and give them good health care. Because what is happening, what we're seeing in the continent, we're seeing a situation where everyone is saying that Africa will have the youngest population. But if that population is not given education and the skills, they will just become consumers, and this is my worry.
Yeah.
But every time most governments in this continent are looking for short-term solution because of course, the media and the political background. But I think there needs to be a long-term plan on how to educate its people. And one of the ways I mentioned before is that we need to increase our capital market, also either regional or continental. We need to pull a bigger capital market where companies can go and also liquidate and source more cash flow. Because what we see continuously in the continent, if there's a boom anywhere in developed nations, we always see capital outflow and our currency dips, and we are always bending down. But guess what? We're the richest continent. We have all the mineral resources, but we don't control the price, and we can't even raise capital. We always have to go to Europe. But one of the ways is putting governments need to come together, and we are hoping the African Free Trade Continental Agreement will help to increase that. Okay. But there needs to be a long-term fix. It cannot be short-term anymore.
All right, so I think there's a fantastic note to end this conversation on. Thank you so much, Ekos Akpokabayen, for joining me on Business Edge. We'll definitely be talking to you sometime soon. Do have a good day. All right, as we wrap things up, that means it takes us straight to NC4 to watch, and here we go. Mining royalty company Altus Strategies has signed an agreement with the Egyptian Mineral Resources Authority to receive a gold exploration license in the country. The company, which acquired La Mancha Holding, in which Egypt's billionaire Sawiri's family has the largest stake, said the license applies for the AKH Gold Limited exploration in the country's eastern desert. Kenya's National Treasury says the country will reduce its budget deficit to 7.5% of gross domestic product in the 2021-2022 financial year. This is a 1.5% drop from 9.0% this fiscal year. The Treasury document shows that economic growth is expected to rebound from the virus-induced slump, expanding by 6.4% this year from an estimated 0.6% last year. Ivory Coast Domestic Cocoa Traders Association, GNI, has called on the country's regulator to introduce reforms that would end the dominance of 6 multinationals in handling the West African country's cocoa exports. GNI, which represents 15 domestic cocoa companies with purchasing and export capacity of about 300,000 tons of beans a year, said their survival depends on introducing the changes. And finally, the Central Bank of Nigeria has appointed 3 pre-shipment inspection agents and 2 monitoring and evaluation agents for the nation's non-oil sector. In a statement, the CBN said each of the appointed agents would cover an allocated area of the country. The areas include Northwest and North Central, Southwest and South South, and Southeast and Northeast. And that's it on this edition of Business Edge. As always, thank you for joining me. Don't forget to follow us on social media. We are at News Central TV. Head to our website, www.newscentral.africa, and also download our mobile app. We are on Play Store and Apple App Store. Till next time, I'm Tolulope Adileru Balogun.